It's now very doubtful that the Ba'athist regime can repress its way out of this, as it did in Hama 30 years ago. And of course, the world has changed a lot since 1982. But the opposition clearly is not headed for the speedy downfall of the regime, such as we saw in Tunisia and Egypt. Also, the current impasse in Libya, which is so damaging for the Libyan people, and the terrible train of events in Iraq that we've seen over the past 8 or 20 years, has shown that external military intervention and other forms of external coercion cannot themselves assure the kind of successful transition to a sustainable democratic order that I think most of the people in this room would like to see in all these countries. I'd like to step back a bit. It is clear that Syria is a key actor in the region. It's almost like Goldman Sachs, it's too big to fail. Not sure. Definitely not like Lazard. I think it's also clear that there is a certain amount that regional and other outside actors can do to help steer the direction and pace of change inside Syria. My perspective is that of someone with great affection for Syrian people, spanning many years and a wide variety of their political views. My perspective is also that of someone who lived for 6 years inside a society in Lebanon that was racked by civil war, where I saw and directly experienced the fact that wars of all kinds, and especially civil wars, are inherently inimical to the basic human rights and well-being of civilians, especially the most vulnerable among them. The sad later examples of this, post-Lebanon, in the region have been Iraq and more recently Libya. I know that there's great suffering inside Syria right now. Much or most of it is regime caused, but we shouldn't forget the effects of these 3 or 4 years of terrible drought that have uprooted people, as was mentioned earlier, from so many rural livelihoods and communities. Nor should we forget the impact of the 700,000 or million refugees from Iraq who were welcomed by Syria and came in and caused an additional burden and demand on housing, food, and basic resources. I go back to some of the thinking and writing I was doing in the 1990s. In columns in Al-Hayat at the time, I was noting that the Ba'athist regimes in both Syria and Iraq were actually behind all the propaganda, minority-based regimes. Regimes very like the apartheid regime in South Africa. And I asked in those columns whether and how either of those Ba'athist countries could make a transition out of that situation of minority rule as successfully as South Africa was doing right then in the 1990s. Now, it happens that I've actually done some fairly in-depth studies of how the transition took place in South Africa, and I think it behooves us all to understand how that happened. I have a whole chapter in my book, Amnesty After Atrocity, that is about what brought the leaderships on both sides in South Africa to the conclusion that they needed to negotiate. The essential features of what happened there were that it was not all centered around the single person of Nelson Mandela, as the kind of the pop psychology version in this country would have it. Rather, on both sides, you had political forces that were coherent, relatively disciplined, politically very experienced, and increasingly wise. It was not, in other words, a story of Nelson Mandela and Frederick de Klerk, 2 men sitting down, negotiating something, and then they walk out and get a Nobel Peace Prize each. It was a story of the 2 organizations of which those men were disciplined members, the ANC on one side and the South African Broederbond on the other side, along with its public face, the National Party. And how the leaderships of those 2 long-standing, very disciplined and tough organizations came to realize 3 crucial things. Number 1, there was no solution to the problems they faced through force. Number 2, they had to pursue a path that was not dominated by vengeance and scorekeeping, but allowed a fresh start to everyone on the basis of equality and moving forward. And thirdly, that their approach was politically inclusive of everyone and should be based on simple principles of human equality and equal co-citizenship going forward. That was the ANC and the Bund/National Party. This is not the situation on either side of the equation in Syria today. And I think it's very important to stress that such forces do not exist in today's Syria. And yet you have this country that is in essence too big to fail. What is the answer? I think the only answer is that all the friendly forces in the international community need to figure out how or who or in what way that kind of a negotiated transition to to an equality-based democratic system can be facilitated/mediated in Syria. Oh, I lost my place here. A policy of principled, constructive engagement with all the political and social forces in Syria, including the government and its many supporters, and the opposition in its many different facets and networks, is much more likely to be helpful than a policy that is focused solely on finger-pointing and punishments. Constructive engagement, of course, was what Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and other Western governments pursued toward the apartheid regime in South Africa. And while they were doing that, international civil society was organizing the boycotts and doing the consciousness raising. And the combination of those two things really helped focus the National Party, the Bund, on the need to engage seriously. The South African transition was not perfect. Thousands of people lost their lives. There were terrible wars in the region. But I think where they ended up in 1996 was so much better than where they had been in 1986. The crimes of which the Syrian government stands accused are not, after all, any worse than the crimes the apartheid regime committed inside South Africa and throughout a whole swathe of the neighboring region. I would just like to conclude with a couple of quick notes. I think I must have missed a page here. I'm really sorry. I'll come back to Turkey in a moment. Maybe I'll talk a little quickly about Turkey now. Turkey, as I mentioned, is the country with the longest common border with Syria. The Turkish government has good relations with both the government in Syria and with many sectors of the opposition. Turkey's government also, crucially, has undergone its own transition to democracy and civilian control of the military just over the past 15 years. Wonderful experience, that plus its ability to create, I would say, an entirely new form of moderately Islamist constitutional democracy. I mean, all these are lessons that are extremely valuable for Syrians. And plus, if you go to Syria, I mean, Turkey, it's like they're all in love with Turkey. Who thought? I mean, when I started going to Syria in the 1970s, people were still, very angry, and they wouldn't call it Turkish coffee, and they were worried about, still griping about the French having given away Alexandretta province in the 1930s. And you go there now, and everybody wants to take a vacation in Turkey. They welcome the Turks who come in. There's no visa requirement at the border. I mean, Turkey has fabulous standing